We're just gonna. What do you think? Did you hit the?
It says we're live.
It says it's being bad. Time vortex, wooglies. Yeah, what do you need? We're live, Ryan.
Hi. Sorry.
I'll talk to you in 5 minutes. Okay. Hey everybody, that's weird. That's a weird beginning. Welcome to the Nutmeg Tavern. We are live and stuff. I think everything's working-ish. Hey, super to have you here in this live stream. And we are going to do a Q&A. But before we do a Q&A, we're going to play a little something special. There's a reading from 1806 I want to read. But before I get there, I want to touch on Macaroni Gluer's question. She had a question about salt. Did they redo salt, etc.? Would they reuse it even in a family setting? Good question, interesting question. And, I don't have a specific reference to that, but I am super positive that households would do that. And one of the reasons why is I was just reading something about people at the very beginning of the Revolutionary War, and there was a salt problem right away. The British were specifically trying to keep salt from coming to the colonies. And the author of that piece talked about people rushing out immediately and boiling salt water in the oceans. Everybody understood exactly where this salt was coming from. And the idea that you could easily just basically take all your salt and boil it back down into salt. So even if it was just a brine solution, they knew what was up with that. And if salt was expensive at any particular time, they knew exactly what to do to get salt. So I am pretty positive that families would do that. Now, on to this 1806 reading. In 1806, there was an eclipse. And what's his name? What is his name? James Fenimore Cooper was alive at the time. He was actually at home in Pennsylvania, yes?
What's the video thing called on here?
It's just under marathon.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Okay.
You can tell me that.
Anyway, he was at home at the time after having been a sailor for a certain amount of time. He came home for a rest, and during that time, there was a total eclipse that went right over his family's estate in Pennsylvania. And later on in his life, in the 1830s, someone asked him about it, and he wrote up a complete description of it, and it is so on point and interesting, having to do with both our connection with the eclipse that just happened. And of course, we went down to totality, so I got to experience that just like he did. And the reading was just so interesting that we decided we would just do that reading real quick. It is going to take till about 4 o'clock, and then we will come in for more Q&A. So, Ivy, play the clip. The eclipse of the sun, which you requested me to describe, occurred in the summer of 1806 on Monday, the 16th of June. Its greatest depth of shadow fell upon the American continent somewhere about the latitude of 42 degrees. I was then on a visit to my parents at the home of my family amongst the highlands of Otsego, in that part of the country where the eclipse was most impressive. My recollections of the great event and the incidents of that day are as vivid as if they had occurred but yesterday. Lake Otsego, the headwaters of the Susquehanna, lies at nearly as possible in the latitude of 42 degrees. The village, which is the home of my family, is beautifully situated at the foot of the lake, in a valley lying between two nearly parallel ranges of heights, quite mountainous in character. The Susquehanna, a clear and rapid stream flowing from the southeast shore of the lake, is crossed by a high wooden bridge, which divides the main street of the little town from the lawns and the meadows on the eastern bank of the river. Here were all the materials that could be desired: lake, river, mountain, wood, and the dwellings of man, to give full effect to the varied environment of light and shadow throughout that impressive day. Throughout the belt of the country, to be darkened by the eclipse, the whole population were in a state of almost anxious expectation for weeks before the event. On the eve of the 16th of June, our family circle could think or talk of little else. I had then a father and 4 brothers living. And as we paced the broad hall of the house or sat about the family board, our conversation turned almost entirely upon the movements of the planets and comets, occultations and eclipses. We were all exulting in the feeling that a grand and extraordinary spectacle awaited us, a spectacle which millions then living could never behold. There may have been a tinge of selfishness in the feelings that we were thus favored beyond others, and yet I think the emotion was too intellectual in its character to have been altogether unworthy. Many were the prophecies regarding the weather, the hopes and fears expressed by different individuals on this important point. As evening drew near, a passing cloud might veil the grand vision from our sight. Rain, mist would sadly impair the sublimity of the hour. I was not myself among the desponding. The great barometer in the hall, one of the very few then found in the state west of Albany, was carefully consulted. It was propitious. It gave promise of dry weather. Our last looks that night, before sleep fell upon us, were turned towards the sunlit heavens. And at the first movement in the morning, I was able to open the window and again to examine the sky. When I rose from my bed in the early morning, I found the heavens serene and cloudless. Day had dawned, but the shadows of night were still lingering over the valley. As my eye rested on the familiar view of an object of interest, it suddenly attracted my attention. I discovered a star, a solitary star twinkling dimly in a sky which had now changed its hue to a pale grayish twilight, while vivid touches of coloring were beginning to flush the eastern sky. There was absolutely no other object visible in the heavens. Cloud there was none, not even the lightest vapor. That lonely star excited a vivid interest in my mind. I continued at the window gazing and losing myself in a sort of daydream. That star was a heavenly body. It was known to be a planet, and my mind was filling itself with images of planets and suns. My brain was confusing itself with vague ideas of magnitude and distance, and of the time required by light to pierce the apparently inimitable void that lay between us, of the beings who might inhabit an orb like that, with life, feeling, spirit, and aspirations like my own. Soon the sun himself rose into view, and I caught a glimpse of fiery light glowing among the branches of the forest on the eastern mountain. I watched, as I had done 100 times before, the flushing of the skies, the gradual illuminations of the different hills, crowned with an undulating and ragged outline of pines nearly 200 feet in height. The gold light glided silently down the breast of the western mountains and opening clearer views of grove and field until lake, valley, and village lay smiling in one cheerful glow of warm sunshine. Our family party assembled early. We were soon joined by friends and connections, all eager and excited, and each provided with a colored glass for the occasion. By 9 o'clock, the cool air, which is peculiar to the summer nights in the Highlands, had left us, and the heat of midsummer filled the valley. The heavens were still absolutely cloudless, and a more brilliant day never shone in our own bright climate. There was not a breath of air, and we could see the rays of heat quivering here and there on the smooth surface of the lake. There was every appearance of a hot and sultry noontide. We left the house and passed beyond the grounds into the broad and grassy street which lay between the gates and the lake. Here there were no overhanging branches to obstruct the view. The heavens, the wooded mountains, the limpid sheet of water before us were all distinctly seen. As the hour of the eclipse drew near, our eagerness and excitement increased to an almost boyish impatience. The elders of the party were discussing the details of some previous eclipse. Leaving them to revive their collections, I strolled away, glass in hand, through the principal streets of the village. Scarce a dwelling or a face in the little town that was not familiar to me, and it gave me additional zeal to the pleasure of a holiday at home to meet one's townsfolk under the excitement of an approaching eclipse. As yet, there was no great agitation, although things wore a rather unusual aspect for the busy hour of a summer's day. Many were busy with their usual tasks. Women and children were coming and going with pails of water. The broom and the needle were not yet laid aside. The blacksmith's hammer and the carpenter's plane were heard in passing their shops. Loaded teams and travelers in wagons were moving through the streets. The usual quiet traffic at the village counters had not yet ceased. A farm wagon, heavily laden with hay, was just crossing the bridge, coming in from the fields, the driver looking drowsy with sleep, wholly unconscious of the movement of the heavens. The good people in general, however, were on the alert. At every house, someone seemed to be watching, and many groups were passed. Those eager, turned-up faces in excited conversation spoke the liveliest interest. It was said that there were not wanting one or two philosophers of the skeptical school among our people who did not choose to commit themselves to the belief in a total eclipse of the sun, simply because they had never seen one. Seeing is believing, we are told, though the axiom admits the dispute. But what these worthy neighbors of ours had not seen, no powers of reasoning or fullness of evidence could induce them to credit. Here was the dignity of human reason. Here was private judgment taking a high stand. Anxious to witness the conversion of one of these worthies with boyish love of fun, I went in quest of him. He had left the village, however, on business. But true to his principles, before mounting his horse that morning, he had declared to his wife that he was not running away from that eclipse. Nay, more, with noble candor, he averred that if the eclipse did overtake him in the course of his day's journeys, he would not be above acknowledging it. This was highly encouraging. I had scarcely returned to the family party, left on the watch, when one of my brothers, more vigilant or with more clear sight than his companions, exclaimed that he clearly saw a dark line drawn on the western margin of the sun's disk. All faces were instantly turned upwards, and through the glasses we could indeed now see a dusky but distant object darkening the sun's light. An exclamation of delight, almost triumph, burst involuntarily from the lips of all. We were not to be disappointed. No cloud was there to veil the grand spectacle. The vision, almost unearthly in its sublime dignity, was about to be revealed to us. In an incredibly short time, the oval formation of the moon was discerned. Another joyous burst of delight followed as one after another declared that he beheld with distinctness the dark oval outline, drawn against the flood of golden light. Gradually, and at first quite imperceptibly to our sight, that dark and mysterious sphere gained upon the light, while a feeling of watchful stillness verged upon reverence fell upon our excited spirits. As yet, there was no change perceptible in the sunlight falling upon the lake or mountain. The familiar scene wore its usual smiling aspect, bright and glowing as on any other days of June. The people, however, were now crowding into the streets. Their usual labors were abandoned, forgotten for the moment. All faces were turned upwards. So little, however, was the change in the power of light that to a careful observer it seemed more of the gaze of faith then positive perception, which turned the faces all upward. Gradually, a fifth, even a fourth of the sun's disk became obscured, and still the unguarded eye could not endure the flood of light. It was only with colored glass that we could note the progress of the phenomenon. The noonday heat, however, began to lessen, and something of the coolness of early morning returned to the valley. Soon a somber, yellowish, and unnatural coloring was shed over the country. A great change had taken place. The trees in the distant heights had lost their verdure and airy character. They were taking the outline of dark pictures graven upon an unfamiliar sky. The lake wore a lurid aspect, very unusual. All living creatures seemed thrown into a state of agitation. The birds were fluttering to and fro in great excitement. They seemed to mistrust that this was not the gradual approach of evening, and were undecided in their movements. Even the dogs, honest creatures, became uneasy and drew closer to their masters. The eager, joyous look of interest and curiosity which earlier in the morning had appeared in almost every countenance was now changed into an expression of wonder or anxiety or thoughtfulness according to the individual character. Every house now gave up its tenants, as the light failed more and more with every passing second. The children became flocking about their mothers in terror. The women themselves were looking about uneasily for their husbands. The American wife is more apt than any other to turn with affectionate confidence to the stronger arm for support. The men were very generally silent and grave. Many a laborer left his employment to be near his wife and children as the dimness and darkness increased. I once more took my position beside my father and my brothers before the gate of our own grounds. The sun lay a little obliquely to the south and east, in a most favorable position possible for observation. I remembered to have examined in vain the whole dusky canopy in search of a single cloud. It was one of those entirely unclouded days, less rare in America than in Europe. The steadily waning light, the gradual approach of darkness became more impressive as we observed this absolutely transparent state of the heavens. The birds, which a quarter of an hour earlier had been fluttering about in great agitation, seemed now convinced that night was at hand. Swallows were dimly seen dropping into chimneys. The martins returned to their little boxes. The pigeons flew home to their dovecotes. And through the open door of the small barn we saw the fowls going to roost. The usual flood of sunlight had now become so much weakened that we could look upwards long and steadily without the least pain. The sun appeared like a young moon of 3 or 4 days old, though, of course, with a larger and more brilliant crescent. Looking westward a moment, a spark appeared to glitter before my eye. For a second I believed it to be an optical illusion, but in another instant I saw it plainly to be a star. One after another they came into view more rapidly than in the evening twilight, until perhaps 50 stars appeared to us in a broad, dark zone of the heavens, crowning the pines of the western mountain. This wonderful vision of stars during the noontide of the day filled the spirit with singular sensations. Suddenly one of my brothers shouted aloud, "The moon!" Quicker than thought, the eye turned eastward again, and there floated the moon, distinctly apparent to a degree that was almost fearful. The spherical form, the character, the dignity, the substance of the planet were clearly revealed as I have never beheld them before or since. It looked grand, dark, majestic, and mighty, as it thus proved its power to rob us entirely of the sun's rays. We were all but larger children. In the daily life, we judge of objects by their outward aspect. We are accustomed to think of the sun and also of the moon as sources of light, as ethereal, almost spiritual in their essence. But the positive material nature of the moon was now revealed to our senses with a force of conviction, a clearness of perception that changed all of our usual ideas in connection with the planet. This was no interposition of vapor, no deceptive play of shadow, but a vast mass of obvious matter that was interposed between the sun above us and the earth on which we stood. The passage of two ships at sea, sailing on opposite courses, is scarcely more obvious than this movement of one world before another. Darkness, like that of early night, now fell upon the village. My thoughts turned to the sea. A sailor at heart, already familiar with the face of the ocean, I seemed in mental vision to behold the grandeur of that vast pall of a supernatural shadow falling suddenly upon the sea during the brightest hour of the day. The play of light and shadow upon the billows, always full of interest, must at that hour have been indeed sublime. And my fancy was busy with pictures of white-sailed schooners and brigs and ships gliding like winged spirits over the darkened waves. I was recalled by a familiar and insignificant incident. The dull tramp of hooves on the village bridge. A few cows, believing that night had overtaken them, were coming homeward from the wild open pastures about the village, and no wonder the kindly creatures were deceived. The darkness was now much darker, much deeper than the twilight which usually turns their faces homewards. The dew was falling perceptibly, as much as at any hour of the previous night. The coolness was so great that the thermometer must have fallen many degrees from the great heat of the morning. The lake, the hills, and the buildings of the little town were swallowed up in the darkness. An absence of the usual lights in the dwellings rendered the obscurity still more impressive. All labor had ceased, and the hushed voices of people only broke the absolute stillness by subdued, whispering tones. "Hist! The whippoorwill," whispered a friend near me, and at the next moment, as we listened, in profound silence, we distinctly heard from the eastern bank of the river the wild and plaintive note of that solitary bird of the night, slowly repeated at intervals. The song of the summer bird, so full in June, had entirely ceased for the last half hour. A bat came flitting about our heads. Many stars were now visible, though not in sufficient number to lessen the darkness. At one point only, in the far distant northern horizon, did something of the brightness of dawn appear to linger. At 12 minutes past 11, the moon stood revealed in its greatest distinctness, a vast black orb, so nearly obscuring the sun that the face of the great luminary was entirely and absolutely darkened, though the corona of rays of light appeared beyond. The gloom of night was upon us. A breathless intensity of interest was felt by all. There would appear to be something instinctive in the feelings with which man gazes at all phenomena in the heavens. The peaceful rainbow, the heavy clouds of a dark storm, the vivid flash of electricity, the falling meteor, the beautiful lights of the aurora borealis, fickle as they play fancy. These never fail to fix the attention with something of peculiar feelings, different in character from that which we observe with any other spectacle on the earth. Connected with all grand movements in the skies, there seems an instinctive sense of inquiry, of anxious expectation, akin to awe, which may possibly be traced to the echoes of grand Christian prophecies, whispering to our spirits and endowing the physical sight with some mysterious mental prescience. In looking back at that impressive hour, such now seems to me the feelings of the youth making one of that family group, all apparently impressed with a sensation of the deepest awe. I speak with certainty, a clearer view than I had ever yet had of the majesty of the Almighty, accompanied with a humbling and, I trust, a profitable sense of my own utter insignificance. That movement of the moon, that sublime voyage of the world, often recurs to my imagination, even at this distant day, as distinctly, as majestically, as nearly as fearful as when it was then beheld. A group of silent, dusky forms stood near me. One emotion appeared to govern all. My father stood immovable, some 15 feet from me, but I could not discern his features. 3 minutes of darkness, all but absolute, elapsed. They appeared strangely lengthened by the intensity of feelings and the flood of overpowering thought which filled the mind. Thus far, the sensation created by this majestic spectacle had been one of humiliation and awe. It seemed as if the great Father of the universe had visibly and almost palpably veiled his face in wrath. But, appalling as the withdrawal of light had been, most glorious, most sublime was its restoration. The corona of light above the moon became suddenly brighter. The heavens beyond were illuminated. The stars retired. The light began to play along the ridges of the distant mountains. And then a flood of grateful, cheering, and consoling brightness fell into the valley with a sweetness and a power inconceivable to the mind unless the eye has actually beheld it. I can liken this sudden, joyous return of light after the eclipse to nothing of the kind that is familiarly known. It was certainly nearest to the change produced by the swift passage of a shadow of a very dark cloud, but it was the effect of this instantaneous transition, multiplied more than 1,000-fold. It seemed to speak directly to our spirits with full assurance of protection, of gracious mercy, and of that divine love which has produced all the glorious combinations of matter for our enjoyment. It was not in the least like the gradual dawning of day or the actual rising of the sun, which there is no graduation in change. It was sudden, amazing, like the imagination would teach us to expect of the advent of a heavenly vision. I know that philosophically I'm wrong, but to me it seemed that the rays might actually be seen flowing through the darkness in torrents till they had again illuminated the forest, the mountains, the valley, and the lake with their growing, genial touch. There was another grand movement as the crescent of the sun reappeared and the moon was actually seen steering her course through the void. Venus was still shining brilliantly. This second passage of the moon lasted but a moment to the naked eye. As it ceased, my eye fell upon the scene around me. The street, now as distinctly seen as ever, was filled with the population of the village. Along the lines of the road, stretching for a mile from the valley against the side of the mountain, were 20 wagons bearing travelers or teams from among the hills. All had stopped on their courses, impelled apparently by unconscious reverence as much as by curiosity, while every face was turned towards heaven, and every eye drank in the majesty of the sight. Women stood in the open street near me with streaming eyes and clasped hands, and sobs were audible in different directions. Even the educated and the reflecting men at my side continued silent in thought. Several minutes passed before the profound impressions of the spectacle allowed of speech. At such a moment the spirit of man bows in humility before his Maker. The changes of the unwonted light through the graduations, the full brilliancy of day was restored. It must have been very similar to those by which it had been lost, but they were little noted. I remember, however, the marking marking the instant when I could first distinguish blades of grass at my feet, and later again watching the shadows of leaves on the graveled walk. The white lilies in my mother's flower garden were observed by others among the first objects of vegetation that could be distinguished from the windows of the house. Every living creature was soon rejoicing again in the blessed restoration of light after that frightful moment of night at noonday. Men who witnessed any extraordinary spectacle together are apt in after times to find pleasure in conversing on its impressions. But I do not remember to have ever heard a single being freely communicative on the subject of his individual feelings at the most solemn moment of the eclipse. It would seem as if sensations were aroused too closely connected with the constitution of the spirit to be irreverently and familiarly discussed. I shall only say that I have passed a varied and eventful life, and that it has been my fortune to see earth, heavens, ocean, and man in most of their aspects. But never have I beheld any spectacle which so plainly manifested the majesty of the Creator, or so forcibly taught the lesson of humility to man as the total eclipse of the sun. Special thank you to the viewer that suggested that reading, and special thank you to Lauren for going through and doing just a little bit of trimming. It had a little middle section that really was an odd story and wasn't important to the eclipse description itself. So,
and a little bit of even more description of the landscape.
Yeah.
It's
like, okay. Somebody here said he was a little, wordy. Well, yeah, okay. That's what the whole point was in the early 19th century. Was, he was paid to be wordy. So I think he did a good job.
And one of the editor of the piece was noting in the compilation I got it from that at the time he wrote this story, he was, I believe, away from home. And at the time he saw the eclipse, he'd been away from home for a time. So he was enjoying being back home again in his familiar countryside.
The other really, really interesting thing about this was that it wasn't published. And in fact, it was a letter, and it may have never even been sent. So it's sort of one of those lost little pieces. So it is very interesting to sort of recapture that. I mean, if he intended to publish it, he probably would have worked on it more.
That's true.
And so, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So, okay. What's next? Oh, you know what I forgot? Patreon names down on my desk. Anyway, Ivy's going to do that for me. Careful going through the vortex. Where do we start here, question-wise? What do you think, guys?
We will start at the top. Now, the first one is actually a super chat instead of a question. It's from Moose. Where's your beer or rum? I'm 12 beers deep. What do you got there?
This is something that was sort of unmarked in a bottle back here. It's interesting.
It's mystery.
Yes, it's a mystery.
Okay, so the first question is, how costly is it to reenact the 18th century?
It can be very costly. Obviously, like if you want to do, like World War II and you buy a tank, right? It would be really expensive. And some things in the 18th century reenacting can kind of be like that. You buy an artillery piece or something. But there are particular things you can do within reenacting that can be fairly inexpensive. And one of the least expensive ones to work on is a sailor impression, because the sailors many times had to make their own clothing, slops out of particular kinds of fabric, and so that would be fairly crude. So it would be something that you could easily sew up yourself and not be really off the mark for what a sailor looks like. And so, doing a sailor outfit, I don't want to say a number, but isn't that bad? You could do, and sailors, probably they didn't even necessarily have muskets. They might have a half pike, so you can just have basically a trench spear, and a lot of times they went around barefoot. So it's the inexpensive one to do. I don't know how to say it beyond that.
No, I
Got a
think
good
that
enough
was
answer?
good. And just basically, any impression that uses laborer clothing is always going to be
Yes.
more reasonable because it was in the time period too.
Right, exactly. Rather than a regimental coat and something like that, that's gonna be expensive right off the bat.
Do you have an estimate for how much a ship's boat would have weighed? Just because, of course, they would have had to pick it up and move it around quite a bit.
Yeah, they're not light. And one of the references to one of the ship's boats that went down to, and this isn't 18th century, but it's later, going down to the South Pole, and their ship's boats were weighing more than a ton. So I can imagine that a standard, even smallest ship's boat is going to be fairly heavy. And maybe the lightest one was still 1,000 pounds. So it's going to take, 4 men, 6 men working really hard to lift it up and carry it someplace. So they couldn't easily move those boats from off the ship onto the water. They had to use, basically block and tackle to do that because they're heavy things.
Okay, I'm going to skip a bit because here's Kitty Cat Co 29 saying, did they have veterinarians?
Did they have veterinarians?
Yes.
Okay, am I covering that here?
Yes,
I'm covering
it's
it.
time.
I don't have all the material. Do
It's
I have
okay.
it?
I've got them over here. I
Okay,
think.
okay. So I didn't know that we were going to do that. I thought maybe we were going to, but we're doing it now.
Yes, Ivy. There's some pictures in the. Did you pull them in?
Yes,
Okay. Very good.
So yes, they had veterinarians, and what's that person's name? Like the Greek one or the Roman one?
Oh dear. Okay, this is from 3000 BC in Mesopotamia, and the name is Earl Galadina, something like that.
Yeah, so they've been working on animal medicine for an awfully long time. It seems like if you really needed it, so there were probably, say, like a farmer in an area, and he would be really good at taking care of his animals and medical wise, and of course the farmers in that area would always go to that guy, right? Or else their cattle would die. So people are always working on that, but the things that are most the ones that get the most attention in our time period are horses, because you have an awful lot of horses. It's sort of like if somebody who takes care of a horse is like a mechanic today. Everybody needs a horse for different kinds of utility, for moving things or plowing or whatever. So you have to have medical people take care of horses, and horses are so very delicate. Just about anything will kill a horse. Oh, it rolled around in the field because it was happy. Oh, it twisted its gut and died. Horses are terrible and they take a lot of care. So horses need that, and there were even people called a horse leech. So that was somebody who was a horse doctor, took care of horses specifically. And there was a sort of schooling for veterinarians that starts in the 18th century in France. What is that, about 1769?
Yes. So let's see.
So
I'm sorry. Here it is. France in 1762 by the veterinary surgeon Claude Bourgalet.
Right. So he starts with this whole veterinarian kind of school, but that it was happening before that. They just didn't have necessarily schooling for it. You probably trained under someone who was good at that in the first place. So what kind of slides do we have? There we go. Anatomy, comparative anatomy. That is being studied in the time period. This is the Age of Enlightenment, and so all these sort of new scientific people are popping out of the woodwork, and they're studying what the skeletons are like and the muscle structure. That isn't necessarily, they're doing it necessarily for medical purposes, at least for animals, but it's just a general, we want to understand everything science and anatomy and natural history wise. But of course, doctors are using the same information, say, it's like, okay, if the muscles are made in a particular way on animals, what about people, and how can we use that? So there's that. Here is our, this is 1802, Edinburgh Weekly Journal. The outlines of the veterinary art or principles of medicine as applied to the knowledge and structure, functions, and economy of the horse, the ox, the sheep, and the dog. And so here we are. We've got somebody who is going to teach that. Or is it a book? Is it a book? Yes. Large volumes, 8 volumes with anatomical plates and boards. So we got books particularly about the veterinary art. Here is another advertisement, 1807. A professor of the veterinary art, after long experience and successful and extensive practice in the sublime science, which has been induced to offer his services to the public at large. So that fairly large advertisement, and he's doing also even, chirurgical operations. Part of his profession will be performed with the utmost dexterity. Here is a great trade card for Norbonne, the dog doctor, on James Street, St. James Street. So, and this, you did it, this is your interpretation of it.
This
right?
is my rendition.
Right.
And there were other trade cards specifically for these, kind of starting in that very late 18th, early 19th century. Sheep restoratives, specifically, other people specifically doing horse
A sheep
stuff.
needs restored.
They looked a little, under the weather, so. Okay, I think that was, yes,
Okay.
and that was in case we wanted to have a look at this particular picture. Okay, so you talked about the ship's boats, right? Okay, good. All right, so ship's biscuits. You talked about them in the ship's biscuit video about crushing them and also using them to make bread. Are there specific methods or recipes for turning those ship's biscuits into bread?
Well, you've got to grind them right back up into a flour consistency. And they're going to be weird. It's probably going to be a whole lot more like cornbread than anything else because, of course, the flour has already gone through some like chemical things with the drying out and even the heating up. So it's hard to say exactly how that's going to be, treated. But I don't have any specific recipes for that. Normally, they're pounding up their ship's biscuits and they're using them as a thickener or as a little flavor on its own, like in the lobscouse and in other dishes. So restoring it to something bread-like, that's a little different.
Okay. So, do you have a favorite activity from the time period and a favorite meal that you've made?
Well, I do enjoy the arts of the sailor. I think the things that sailors are doing are very interesting, with the interesting kind of knots and the idea that they're doing special kinds of sewing, etc. So, if I was, but it's hard. Just like people saying, what's your favorite dish or whatever. I enjoy almost all those trades, at least a little bit, studying them, understanding them. I'm not much of I'm only interested in this one particular part of it. So to say what's my favorite is...
What's your favorite book? You're like, well, that is a challenge.
Yeah. What's my favorite? What's my favorite? Whatever. So that's tough. Meal-wise, we did several different meals this last year, where we specifically did, the feast of this, a feast of that, and even the working man's breakfast, working man's lunch, working man's supper. All interesting studies about what kind of fits together and what's really, really common. Actually, the Poor Man's Feast, the one that was the first out of the Feast series, I thought was a really fun, interesting collection of inexpensive dishes that really went together well.
Okay. Any other 18th century inventions like the turtle submarine that were way ahead of their time?
You know, I saw that question and nothing popped into my mind immediately, but there's a lot out there of, and Diderot's is fun to dig through. So Diderot's Encyclopedia of Arts and Trades is really good for kind of looking at some of those mechanical processes or machines that they're working on. So, you know, something like the Jacquard loom, where they're doing specific, you know, highly intense patterns, and that whole concept there is where sort of punch cards come from and computer operations come from later on. And there's in our time period, there are mechanical computing devices and the really interesting things going on with like what all the things you can do with a sextant, that it's not just finding an altitude, but you can use them in different ways. So yeah, there's a lot of really fun tools, machines that are going on in our time period, and you just kind of got to dig into them. It's fun.
Okay, so have you run across any mentions about the second sleep while you've been doing research?
So second sleep, the idea that especially as you get older, and it happens to me pretty frequently, where you kind of get up after 3 hours and you're awake, but you know you're going to need more sleep. And so you find a particular activity that you do for an hour or 2 hours, and then you go back to sleep. And kind of that way you get 4 hours and then another 4 hours, and there's this gap in the middle. And what do you do in that middle? How can you be productive in that? And that's been something that's been going on with humans for a long time. And is it happening? Are people talking about it in the 18th century? I haven't run into it a lot. There's probably more references, but they can be a little difficult to search because they might have a special term for it, or they don't have any term for it at all, so they don't necessarily describe it. But apparently Benjamin Franklin was somebody who had that kind of a, you know, I think it's what happens when you have a very busy mind, which is something that is, you know, happening to Benjamin Franklin. So after that 3 or 4 hours, your brain says, oh, it's time to think about, you know, chew on something. So there are some people that those 2 hours might be their most productive hours in the day.
Okay. Do you have a favorite alcoholic drink from the 18th century?
Yeah, you know, the meads that we were sent by
and the
one of our,
Nocino.
yes, those, he did a really, really good, and out of alcoholic drinks in the time period, yeah, probably those meads would hit the top of my list.
Is it true that the browner your bread was in the time period, the poorer you were?
Yeah, pretty much. You know, the browner, the coarser, there are a lot of mixed grain breads that are being made for the poorest people in the 18th century. That I would caveat that with saying probably mostly in say Europe and Great Britain. In America, cornbread, basically cornbread's taking over the concept of those mixed grain breads like the rye and the brown breads of Europe. So cornbread's really taking that place. And most people in America were almost proud of the fact that they were eating cornbread all the time instead of the occasional expensive wheat loaf. You know, those Americans, they're kind of goofy and they're proud of their down-to-earthedness at times. So you'll see that happening Whereas in Europe, it's like, people are trying to get away from rye breads or those inexpensive breads. But you still see different sections of society that are still proud of their own versions of dark bread. So let's say you're in Scotland and you're eating oatcakes instead of bread. There are undoubtedly certain segments of that population that say, no, I'm proud of the fact that I am eating my oatcakes instead of white bread.
Okay, can you explain children's education in the 18th century for the different social classes?
Well, it's not something that I've done a ton of specific research on. So that is probably would make a great book. And I'm not going to write a book right here, right this second on the topic. But we see a lot of different kinds of education going on, and you can kind of get a really quick sort of glimpse. So poor people and even middling people, they are sending their children off at a very young age, sometimes out of the house, maybe never to be seen again, into a job. But many times that job, the rules or the contract for the indenture, which it was usually with an apprentice, there was a contract, and like we think of indentured servants, like contract servant. Well, they also had indentures for these contracts for these apprenticeships. And many times the apprenticeship included an education segment. So they were not only, the child had to work for so many years, but they had to be taught a particular trade and their arithmetic up to the rule of 3, or, reading and writing or whatever. So the education is part of that, and different families. So a well-to-do family will have they'll have their own like little mini schoolhouse just for the children of the family. And they might have a servant, an indentured servant, or somebody else as the instructor who lives on the premises or maybe even in that building. And so we have multiple references to that sort of thing happening. Sometimes that particular person will also take on other students. So we have sort of almost very, very formal teaching situations, in more informal teaching situations, people being taught at home. So it is basically all over the place because there is no one size fits all system in that time period. Everybody wants their children to be educated. They have to figure out the best way that they can make that happen.
Did sailors cross bodies of water in the winter, and did they have to break ice to do that sometimes?
Oh yes, very much so. And it really, depending on where you're sailing, at the time you may go through summer and winter, very rapidly. Within, like 2 weeks, you go from the hottest part of the planet to where it is winter, or vice versa, whatever. So if you read something like 2 years before the mast, so that's happening in the 1820s, and he's talking about sailing around Cape Horn and how just the weather was and could be around that area just as terrible as you can imagine. So you have to be up on the rigging. Maybe you got to, bundle up a sail or whatever, and it is coated with ice. And the ropes are icy, the sail is icy, and you've got to bang on it, break the ice off of it with no gloves or anything like that, and bundle that sail up and tie it with I can't even fathom doing that kind of sailing work in that temperature. And then, of course, a month later you're under the equator, and it's boiling hot, and there is no wind at all, and and you have to go up into the sails and throw water on them so they catch more air.
How did sailors store fresh water when they were out at sea?
So fresh water is stored inside of usually, especially early on in the 18th century, and is just stored in very large wooden kegs, like the one over here. So they're using 50-gallon butts or even larger giant water kegs, and they leak. And they also spawn all kinds of growth on the inside, slimy gunk that's growing on there, or different kinds of algae and strange things growing in those kegs. Later on in the 18th century, and especially early 19th century, they started to switch over to iron tanks, but especially that early, they had a lot of iron tank failures, and that's the one thing you don't want to fail. And one of the jobs of people on board the ship, say the purser or maybe a petty officer's duties, was to check the water all the time and to report back to the captain, say once a week, well, there are so many butts of water left, and they'd do the calculation and they would know exactly how many tons of water, how many gallons of water that they had left on the voyage, so that they would know, are we going to run out? Do we need to lower the allowance of fresh water? Do we need to cut off fresh water for anything except for drinking and washing out the salt from your salt provisions? And so they had a lot of, water was one of the most important things. Sometimes you could get lucky and replenish your water if you had torrential rains. Heavy rains would come down. The problem is that what's on the sails and on the rigging where you're catching most of that water is covered with tar and all kinds of dirt, and you'll get really yucky water. So if you have a lot of rain, you can let the first, say, half hour wash it all off and then capture the rain after that. And they would even have ways to capture dew that came on the rigging. So they would tie a special rope at the very bottom that would catch the drip and lead it down. Again, very, very rank water. But if you are dying of thirst, you don't care. And to cover that water topic, make sure to catch Sunday's episode, because I will be talking about some shipboard life, and we'll talk about water in that, and it's a pretty amazing description. So make sure to check that out.
Have you ever run across spruce beer being mentioned in the sailing journals as opposed to the limes and the lemons they may have been using too?
Well, you see the reference to molasses, and that's a really that's a tricky question about what's happening with that, and I think there's even a reference. I was just reading a 19th century Arctic exploration thing last night, and they were talking about having the stuff on board to make beer. And they're on a sailing ship going up to the North Pole. Well, where they're just going north. I don't know if they're ever gonna. It's hard to make it to the North Pole with a ship, let me tell you. But anyway, they had on board those very things. It's like, we're gonna take molasses so that we can make some kind of beverage.
Mm-hmm. Did sea officers suffer eye damage from taking sun altitude through the sextants?
So I don't have my sextant around here, but all sextants have a little sunglasses, basically. So there's all these little shades, and you can put a shade down over the mirror so that if you're taking a sun altitude, it isn't going to hurt your eyes. Or else it wouldn't be a very good instrument.
Have you considered doing content about root cellars or ice houses? And I did put in the chat at the time when this question came up what we have done about ice houses.
Right. Way back in the day, we did a Q&A when we were at Genesee Country Village about their ice house. We talked about ice on the live stream a couple of times, at least once.
Yes.
And we did a whole episode where we had ice and showed pictures of, harvesting ice, even a little movie section, wasn't it? I think so.
Yes,
root cellars
from the
not as-
early
right.
19th century.
Root cellars not as much. And to tell you the truth, not very many references pop up into my head immediately, but they talk about cellars, and sometimes they don't necessarily call them root cellars. They're just They're just cellars. Now, are they under the house or are they beside the house, separate? Probably separate more often than we think. And they also had spring houses where there would be a spring that would come out and they would use that for cooling. Several different things like that.
Is yogurt or other fermented milk products, were they a thing then? Was milk preserved or was it just obtained from the source?
Clotted cream is popular in Great Britain. It's hard to say. I haven't seen very many references for North America, but you don't see them as often. There may be something in William Byrd's diary in the early 18th century about that. I'd have to dig on that one. Yogurt per se, no, especially they wouldn't have used that term. That's something that's very, Eastern European. I'm not sure exactly. So, world around, there are all kinds of interesting milk fermented products, right? And so they had their versions in the 18th century, and clotted cream was probably the biggest one.
Did the 18th century have 16th century reenactors?
I know that they're doing Revolutionary War reenacting in the 1870s, right? So 100 years after that. They might not have had 16th century, but I think that they were interested in Greek and Roman stuff.
Yes.
Especially as we get into the later part of the 18th century, when we get this, new classical kind of thinking, and the fashions start to change to reflect some of those older, all that Baroque fanciness. We're going to get rid of that and get all these clean lines. So the Grecian look and all that. So reenacting, and this gets close too. There was a revival in the 18th century of Shakespearean things.
Yeah.
So they were really interested in that. Now they cleaned it up, right? It's like, well, we're going to get rid of some of that racy stuff that Shakespeare was doing. So.
Yeah, I especially in plays, you'll kind of get that feel quite a bit. Thoughts on trying to travel as they would have then, by foot or by horse? And because this is Sarah M., she was planning on doing something like that. And I put in the trekking kit and the two different trekking kits. The one, what would you leave behind? And then the other one about what's in a quintessential kit. So,
So what's the real question here?
Any thoughts on trying to travel that way? So do you know if we've done anything else that was focused on that kind of thing?
No.
Okay. Then we will stick with the two.
Not that we've done. I'm trying to think about, it's like, what would you do? It's like, now there are the people that have like done the Lewis and Clark trail.
That's true. Very
and
exciting.
done the boats and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not, it's like, how do you do that in this world?
Yeah, but
like,
as an individual,
Right.
Just going on a trek and kind of packing your own gear, I think those would be the best resources for that sort of thing. So it'd be good. Have you watched the Horatio Hornblower TV series, and what did you think of it?
It's been quite a while. We've got them. We've got it at home on DVD, I think. And has Ivy seen them?
No, she hasn't, because they're great, but
Everybody dies and bleeds out of their mouth.
there's quite a bit
They
of.
like to do that.
They're very quite dramatic, and so we
there's
haven't
bullying,
watched
a
them.
lot of bullying.
There
and
is,
things
like
that.
it's a very.
You guys do realize I'm almost 18, right?
Yes, I'm sorry.
It would be
Ivy.
scary. You shouldn't watch it. But no, I enjoyed it. I would hesitate to try to judge it against something like Master and Commander. It's like, don't do that. But
Well, I mean, it had excellent performances.
Yeah.
They did a great job with what they could with costuming and the sets and everything. So we always had fun with it. Okay, so here's Sarah M. About the trekking and the traveling. What do you think of doing it in the modern age? Is it still possible?
anything is possible. Could you get more cliche than
when
that?
I thought about it, I wondered if the people who did it would choose to do it perhaps out west a bit more, where
Yeah, I was thinking Appalachian Trail, but
oh
that's
yeah,
not
that'd be nice.
necessarily what
Because
they
where
would
we
do.
are specifically, it's very built up. I mean, I don't mean it's built up. There's a lot of farms. There's not a lot of open ground.
See, I think it's a shame that something like the Wabash River doesn't have like specific camping spots for people who are trying to go.
Yes, down the
Like
river.
say, oh, you want to start at this area and go all the way down to say the Ohio, and there isn't a. Well, these are automatic kind of spots for that, which seems like a no-brainer, and at least something like the Appalachian Trail is kind of set up for that sort of thing. And I don't know of a good other, hey, let's try, this, specifically for people who wanted to do that, whether it's reenacting in a period fashion or even in a modern sense. But they're probably things similar.
Okay. So, do you know what it meant for a Scottish migrant to have a sponsor upon arrival? What does a sponsor do?
Well, it depends on the period where you're at and the place where you're talking about, even within North America. So, within our time period, most of the locations are very concerned about people who can't support themselves in a particular spot. So if people can't support themselves, then there's a social safety net that pays for those people. So in order to keep that safety net there, their way of dealing with that was to keep people out who didn't start there. So if you weren't from a particular, say, county and you wanted to move into that county and you couldn't necessarily support yourself in an easy way, just say buy property or whatever, they wouldn't let you stay. So they would actually maybe let you stay for a little time, like you're visiting for 30 days or something. And then it's like, time's up, bud. We don't want you here anymore. You got to get out. And different areas had some different kinds of rules about that. Some of them very, very strict. So if you don't have a sponsor, there's no place for you to be. You might not have a job. And that's where kind of indentures kind of come in too. That you had a contract with someone, and so that allowed you to stay in that area. They knew that you had someone to take care of you, and you had a job, and you know. So that's it. That sponsor is taking that place. It's like this person will make sure to take care of me, because you just can't just drop people off in the middle of nowhere in this time period. They're not going to allow people without any sustaining to just be there, because they would feel obligated to take care of them, and so rather than, they just won't let you stay.
Okay. So someone suggested that perhaps you could build a ship's kitchen set while we wait for the actual ship to get built.
You know, that is a really, really
Wouldn't
good
that be
idea. This is a super good idea. You know, one of the tricky parts for that is having a plan for exactly what that ship's galley would look like. So they've got a very, very interesting, maybe the one I haven't toured that many historic ships, and really that's one of those things that would be fun. So, you know, like Friends Goodwill, that's a pretty small boat, and it really doesn't have a galley that's necessarily totally connected with what theirs would have been like, and that's 19th century. At the what's it called, Lauren, in Boston? The Boston Tea Tea Party Ships and Museum. The one we toured had a ship's galley that was like bolted down on the deck.
Yes.
So it was a room about this big, this square, like maybe 6 feet square.
That'd be a little hard for filming.
Right, it's like a booth that all the cooking was done in. Now this was a fairly, again, small, sort of like the semi-truck of the time period, right? So, maybe only a half a dozen crew or maybe 10. So you don't have to have a huge galley for that. But if you had, say, a little bit bigger ship, maybe it's a frigate, a 20-gun ship, whatever, and you've got 100 crew, 120, 200 people, that's going to take a bit of room to be able to cook for that many people. So getting the documentation on that would be a really good study. So
That would be
make sure
that would be delightful.
Ship's galley, make it tomorrow.
And then the boat right afterwards.
Yeah.
So whatever ship you want to do. Do you want to do the names, and then you could do some proverbs too.
Yes.
I had fun with those.
Every week we try to get to, when possible, the brand new Patreon people and new and renewing YouTube members. So new and you're renewing YouTube members this last week, whatever it is. Nicest Christian, Walter Coots, Mind the Timeless, Lloyd Allard, Jamie Roberts, someone just called SB. That sounds very mysterious. Georgina, Jeremiah Norcross, Baduhina, One's 2 Cents, Lewis, Pygar 2, Tony York, KB9RAO. And brand new Patreon folks, Noah Schlafer, yeah, I said that right, Catherine Zimmerman, and super thanks for super long-term major Patreon supporters, Leslie Spivey, Sandy Hoskin, John Gibson, Lisa Fittenhoff, Vincent Romano, and R.G. DeStolf. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple super chats before we move on.
Okay.
So we've got from Max R. Cool. Fun show today. Thanks, Townsends team.
Thank you.
And there's one from Speed and Style Tony. What were common... I'm sorry, hold on. I gotta pull this up because it's... Okay, what were common horse-drawn vehicles of the period? Any public transportation?
Yeah, so obviously you've got, cart horses, two-wheeled. You've got, wagons, and you've got carriages that are sprung. And I think we've done some pictures of some of these different ones. There's a giant section in Diderot's for all these fancy coaches. Lots of pictures of fancy coaches. So just like you're getting a sports car today. Phaetons and all these fun ones. Public transport, so they had things called the omnibus. And it was a bus drawn by a horse. They had mail carts. So if you read Roderick Random, which is a novel, sort of like think Dickens and 100 years earlier. So Roderick Random, I think it's done by I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he rides in, I think it's a mail wagon or something. And that's public transport in England in the time period. And apparently it was just like a box, like a wagon with a wooden box on the top of it instead of it being open. And you couldn't even really see and you would drop down into that and it would have straw in it and people were bumping and hitting each other. And, it was just... It sounded like a pretty amazing experience. Bad, amazing experience. So yeah, lots of different ways to be transported.
I've got a super chat from Susan LeWay. Just wanted to say that my Townsends woolen blanket that I got a few months ago came in very handy when I had the flu last week. So
Ooh,
cozy.
I wonder if it was one of those like Hudson Bay ones or one of the regular ones.
They're all very toasty, and I'm glad it helped.
Nothing quite like a wool blanket.
That's right.
Or those alpaca blankets. Oh yeah, all of it. Those are nice.
I hope you're feeling all better, Susan.
Yeah.
It's no fun. Ivy was sick a couple days ago.
Look at that, Roderick Random already. Good job.
Yeah, I dropped it in the chat. The
That's a
Roderick Ring.
really interesting read.
Yeah, and it's by T. Smollett.
Yeah, Smollett. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so this is a super chat from EZD. Which is best to visit according to my list and why? Williamsburg, Alexandria, Old Philadelphia, North End, Boston, Charleston, or Savannah? And maybe we should have the chat chime in and...
Yeah, because I haven't been to Charleston. Ryan's been to Charleston. He really likes Charleston. I have not been to Savannah. And we've been to Boston. I don't know, North End, Boston, yeah. Old Philadelphia, I've been to Philadelphia and Williamsburg, but it's been in quite a while.
Have you been to Alexandria?
No.
Okay, all right.
No. So we actually maybe have a trip.
Maybe.
Somebody mentioned just
Yes.
today. Anyway. Philadelphia and its downtown section was kind of fun. But I think for like the quantity, Williamsburg was
I
it, right?
think if
For
you
the
were going
most
for
places.
immersion, I think Williamsburg probably would be best for. I mean, they all
Right.
have incredible highlights to them, but I think for immersion and the most concentrated locality,
Yep.
that Williamsburg probably is the top of the
Right.
list. Now, of course, we haven't visited every site, but from what I've heard, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, Williamsburg's kind of made for that, and the other ones have, we're holding some of this,
Right, like
left,
there's little,
whereas-
kind of
Right.
islands within the areas
Right.
that are well preserved and beautiful, but they're not. They weren't kind of.
Yeah, the
put in
interesting thing
mind
about
quite the same
Williamsburg
way.
is it was big in the time period and it shrank. So, it got little, and so they were able to sort of resurrect it as almost like a historical playground versus, say, Philadelphia. It's like, well, that grows up. How are you supposed to keep old Philadelphia
Right.
here? Or, some of these other ones like Boston, which has grown.
Yeah, but truly, I'm sure any of them would be a delight to visit. So, somebody was mentioning that Williamsburg's good too because you can also visit Jamestown and Yorktown because they're very
Exactly.
close as well.
Yep. Very, very, very true.
Okay. So, do you want to do a couple of the proverbs? I remarked new ones from the last time.
New proverbs from the almanac. Poor Richards. Oh gosh, you probably meant this one. I mean, everyone is good. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days.
Yes, that was the one that. Such a classic.
A countryman between two lawyers is like a fish between two cats. Sorry, Joe. Well done is better than well said. He that would live in peace and at ease must not speak all he knows, nor judge all he sees. And a poor man must walk to get his meat for his stomach, a rich man to get a stomach for his meat. I don't know, maybe let Lauren interpret that one for us.
I feel like that's, the rich man has to walk for an appetite to eat his meat. And the poor man has to walk.
To go and scrounge his
To go
food
and scrounge.
because
I was thinking about how, they have to like work hard just to, anyway, I was thinking.
you went in on different tangents.
Yeah, I was thinking about the idea of them having poor digestion because they ate too much rich stuff all the time. Yeah, we're just kind of related. The king's cheese is half wasted in parings, but no matter, 'tis made of the people's milk. Okay, Lauren.
You reminded me of certain things.
What is this? April 15th coming up? It's like a holiday. Anyway, simple man, when a boy, 2 precious jewels were given thee, time and good advice. One thou hast lost, the other thrown away. Well, that's true. The young. Oh, here we go. What's proper is becoming. See the blacksmith with his white silk apron?
I loved that one. Such a great example.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay. Yes.
Okay, somebody had a question. They were wondering if alchemy is something you would run across in 18th century North America, or was that something that had stopped by this particular time period we look at?
Yeah, it's probably more of a, even in Europe, there was a really interesting thing talking about alchemy and the idea that we think it's like a Middle Ages thing, when actually it's a bit more of a, really a 16th and 17th century thing. Mm-hmm. But by the 18th century, it's really fallen out of favor, and sort of the idea of the Enlightenment thinking, and that we will gain, we will somehow gain true enlightenment through the idea of just measuring everything and naming everything. So yeah, and I don't think you're going to see much of it in North America at all. When that's the kind of thing that gets sort of studied and interest in some place that is rich and there's extra time. In North America at the time, everybody's working hard trying to survive. Not that it was necessarily hard to survive, but it was hard to sort of start afresh. So I don't think you're going to see much of that at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the people who would have been researching that kind of thing, like you said with the Enlightenment thinking, they've shifted over to exploring other things. So what was the most common facial hairstyle from that era?
So for English people and English people connected in North America, shaven faces. No beards, no mustaches, none of that. So it was very culturally different. So you might see different kind of facial hair on people from Spain or people from France or different kinds of nationalities. But for the English and the people connected with that in North America, clean shaven is the trend.
How would someone sell their home in this particular time period, or did they just abandon them?
Yeah, there's some abandonment, but there's also, again, contracts, indentures for the purchase of land. Sometimes they even had like auctions. They might call them vendu, but auctions say all kinds of situations, and you'll see references to just standard land contracts. If you look at Patton's, Matthew Patton's diary, he's writing up things exactly like that for different people and being sort of the intermediary, almost kind of like a real estate agent, in the fact that he's there to work with both sides to make sure that when somebody isn't being taken, I guess.
And when I look through newspapers, sometimes you'll see advertisements for the sale of specifically the larger, more expensive areas would advertise in the newspapers. Because there was one that had an ice house attached. That's what was catching my eye at a particular time. So this particular person is wondering, they're interested in theater in the time period and in the ballet and in the opera, but also whether they had more acrobatic things, or was that more of a fair, something that would happen in an outdoor fair setting that would kind of move into theater perhaps during the 19th century, maybe even the late 19th century. And then what about theater costuming?
Yeah, if you want to see some of that acrobatic stuff, if you look at, say, Hogarth images from the middle of the 18th century, and we see, street fairs and different sorts of simple, both theatrical things and like acts that are doing physical entertainment. That was such a long question. I forgot what the beginning part was.
Oh, it was starting with wondering about the acrobatics specifically,
Right.
and then the second part was the costuming.
Yeah, and you said mentions like operas. And they were doing not necessarily operas, but just the song parts of operas. I can't remember what that's called. Where they would, wouldn't have to do the whole.
Oh, like you wouldn't have necessarily the sets
Right.
and the outfits, but
Exactly.
you would be doing the music, performing the
Right.
music.
Maybe with light costuming or whatever. So a lot of different things like that are going on, especially in Great Britain at the time period. But there are echoes of that in North America. And if we looked through the and we even showed the like opera house. Remember
Yes.
the opera house images from
London.
the fire thing and all that kind of good stuff. There are smaller echoes of that in North America in the bigger cities. I don't think much of that's happening in the small areas, but especially frontier. But
Did people celebrate birthdays as much as we do today?
no.
Not at all. Although I think it was definitely in the 1700s. Sometimes was the first recorded birthday cake with the candles on it. Somebody had mentioned it the last time we were talking about that, and I believe it was Dutch or
There we
German.
go. It figures.
Yes,
It
it does. A
were a lot
lot
more
of
about
the
confectionery
party
and- yeah.
traditions seem to come from
Yeah.
they apparently were really good at having parties.
Yes.
Okay, so this person has a question, and I don't know if we can know the answer, but it is, are we aware of any difference or gap in the health and physical capabilities of people from the 18th century compared to people now?
What was the first part of the question again? Gaps
Yeah, a difference or gap
in the physical abilities?
or health.
Yeah,
I don't know. I
don't
mean,
know how to answer it.
because it'd just be hard to judge. Like,
Yeah,
we
it would.
know that they weren't as tall as
Right.
we are now,
Exactly.
on average.
But how do
But
But if
in
they
other
probably
things
had
like
more
strength,
endurance
especially,
and
hard to say.
whatever, So yeah.
Okay, so here is a super chat from EZD. What are your thoughts on the educational PBS Kids animated show Liberty's Kids about 3 kids during the American Revolution, if seen or heard of or not, but if not, highly recommended to watch?
Ivy, you want to?
Yeah, I watched that show when I was a kid. I loved it. I thought it was great. I don't know how accurate it was.
I haven't
but
seen it, so-
I liked it.
I think maybe it came along after
Yeah, it was.
we were too
after-
old to have watched it, but I had a great time watching. I do remember seeing Ivy watching it sometimes.
So Ivy gives it a big thumbs up.
There you go. Okay, all right. You ready to wrap up?
I am
Okay.
ready to wrap up. I think we got most things covered. So much, just tremendous amount of questions. And I'm always amazed by the fact that it's like three minutes into the answer, I'm thinking, boy, I'm just blah, blah. But you guys asked the question, so it's not my fault. It's not my fault. Pretty amazing stuff, amazing, great questions, and there's always more, isn't there? It's like, as there's always another interesting question. What about? And then it leads us all into a great rabbit trail of, building ship's galley sets or whatever. It's like, what's the outside going to look like? We're going to kind of make it sail on that side. Wonder where I'm going to put it. Anyway, or how we're going to fit the camera in there.
True. That's an important one.
Well, we've been pretty creative in the past, so I think we could do it. I'm working on it. Gears are turning as we speak. Super thank you to all the Patreon folks, all the Super Chat folks, all the YouTube members, and the people that gift memberships. There's just so many ways you guys are so helpful to us. Buying cool merch, mugs, and all that good stuff helps us make the next video and the one after that. And more stuff is in the pipeline. The team and I were just talking about a couple more feast videos coming up with some interesting ideas there. So lots of fun stuff. And thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Ivy. And I want to thank every one of you for being in here and encouraging me as we continue to delve into the 18th century and discover what we can learn from it that helps us each and every day. I hope you have a tremendous weekend, and thank you for watching.